Obviously, today we're going to be transitioning from the Old Testament to the New Testament, but first I want to get our bearings to find out where we are so that we can contextualize our reading from Matthew's Gospel. Okay? And as we've been talking about consistently, um, in the Old Testament, what you have is the creation and the fall, and the articulation of successive covenants after the fall are all designed to deal with, to address that primordial problem of the separation of human beings from God that is wrought by the fall, by the original sin. And so we have the original covenant of Eden that Adam and Eve are part of that they break, and so the consequences of that fall are dealt with successfully and progressively in the next articulations of the covenant throughout the Old Testament. But because none of those articulations of the covenant are perfect, what you get are covenant articulations that deal with some things, but have to necessarily leave other things behind, just because you can't do everything all at once when you're dealing with imperfect human beings. And so the Noahide covenant, which is the first articulation of the covenant after the fall, is really a mile wide and an inch deep. It deals with universal humanity, and so its requirements are very, very basic. After all, nobody really lives their lives in the context of universal humanity, right? We live our lives in the context of our family structures, of our immediate friends and people we come in contact with places that are concrete and familiar to us, not in terms of sort of globalized, cosmopolitan, universal humanity. And so, um, uh, so, so, so the fact is that the Noahide covenant doesn't deal very well with particularities, and the most important or most obvious particularity it doesn't deal very well with is family structure, and that's where we see that Noah himself has trouble. He's called righteous in his own generation, but obviously he has difficulty in passing on covenantal righteousness to the next generation. That's of course very important because human beings aren't immortal, and if God's covenantal way that will cultivate righteousness is going to succeed among human beings, it has to not only form one generation and stop, but rather be able to be passed on as well. Okay, so the problems with transmission of the covenant are what are addressed in the Abrahamic covenant, which is the next articulation, right? Because we see that Noah's failings are basically having to do with the organizing the structure of his family, specifically regarding the place of his wife, okay, especially vis-a-vis his sons, and the the place we pick up with Abraham is precisely in the ordering of his family, especially with regard to Sarah, his wife. Okay? Is she wife? Is she sister? That's the first question that we have to ask. And so even the main religious ceremony that's innovated as part of the Abrahamic covenant is of course circumcision, which deals exactly with the act that will result in transmission, first of all, of the family itself, but also the family culture that is the covenantal way that God wants implanted among human beings. And so it's the partnership really between Abraham and Sarah that will allow them cooperatively to raise Isaac, who will then become an heir to the covenant. Okay, so that seems to be the way that the Abrahamic covenant picks up from the Noahide covenant, and makes up for the things that were necessarily left out of the Noahide covenant. And so, but we then see quickly toward the end of Genesis that the Abrahamic covenant doesn't address every possible situation either, because what we see at the end of Genesis is that Jacob and his burgeoning tribe, right, 12 sons, and they all have their families as well, end up in Egypt, which is obviously already a great established civilization with culture and mores, a way of life, a firmly established way of life with its own religious worship, with its own political structure, with its own dietary codes, etc. These things are much more powerful and established than the nascent way of life of Abraham's grandson. And so The problem that we see at the end of Genesis is the problem of assimilation. Okay? So what will happen to the family and nascent tribe when it is dwelling in the midst of this very powerful and influential nation of Egypt? Okay? So then the Mosaic covenant ends up addressing head on the problem of assimilation. So the first thing that has to be done, of course, is to get the Hebrew people out of Egypt. Okay, so to move them beyond the borders of Egypt so that they can have a kind of sovereignty over their own actions. Okay, and but along with that, with this growing people, all right, growing from a family to a tribe to something greater than a tribe, they require that their way of life be formed and organized according to something that's wider and more comprehensive than simply the patriarchal rule that we see with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, what we need is a law. So we need the Hebrew people taken out of Egypt, which is governed by its own law, which is, of course, antithetical to the law that God wants to implant, primarily because it's polytheistic, but there are other things as well. And the law of Moses then will have as its peak the rule that the Hebrews are to worship just one God and no others, which will later be understood to mean that there really is just one God. Okay? And that monotheistic worship will then trickle down and inform the rest of the way of life of the Hebrews, and preserving that religious worship of one God will end up being the goal toward which all of the rest of the law tends and is ordered to. And so, but as we saw then, the Mosaic covenant lacks something as well. What it lacks is articulated at the end of the book of Judges. So the book of Judges, the last line is that everybody does what's right in his own sight because there's no king. Okay? So the problem is that, okay, so we have a law, but who's going to enforce it? And so that's the political problem then that the Davidic covenant addresses, is that we need someone to enforce the law because the people are not self-enforcing, they're not self-governing. So it would be better, of course, if they did self-govern, if they exercised their freedom in accordance with God's law and directed toward the keeping of the covenant. But that's not what they do. And so what they need is external accountability, which will be provided for them by a king, who himself will be accountable to God. And the Davidic monarchy then will be chosen and regulated by God as different than the monarchies of the surrounding kingdoms. And we see the difference of the Davidic monarchy because of the difference of David himself, which is drawn out in contrast to the first Israelite king, who's Saul. And God describes David as a king after his own heart. And we can see primarily what he means by that in David's response to his rebuke by Nathan after the Uriah and Bathsheba affair. And so David accepts his own responsibility for committing the sins of murder and adultery, and repents and does serious penance. And so David's humility, his willingness to recognize his own sins, and therefore to recognize the sovereignty of God above him, is what marks out the Israelite monarchy from other types of monarchy. Okay? Right, but as we saw also, even alongside the various prophecies that we see about the Davidic monarchy, there's a pressure between what we see actually fulfilled in the Old Testament and those, and the true extent of those promises. So, of course, after Solomon, the kingdom is split, and religious worship is also divided. So the northern kingdom has no access to the Jerusalem temple anymore, and to be honest, even the southern kingdom has trouble following the various aspects of the covenant, but especially the requirement of monotheism. And so, because of the people's infidelity, we get the two great exiles, the Assyrian exile and the Babylonian exile. And in response to those things, there are these great prophecies about the restoration of the Davidic king on the throne in Jerusalem. Okay? But when we see them fulfilled, it's not very satisfying. The kings in question are sometimes pretty good, but most of the time not very good. And even the pretty good ones are at least somewhat disappointing and don't really live up to what we were expecting according to the prophecies. And so there's always this kind of this building expectation that there's going to be something more, someone more who will more adequately fulfill those prophecies. Okay, so and we see, especially in Isaiah's prophecy of the suffering servant, which is, you might say, a kind of expansion upon what it means for there to be a monarch after God's own heart. Especially also in the prophecy of the new heavens and the new earth in Isaiah, but then also what we see in especially Jeremiah and also Ezekiel, the prophecy of a new type of law which will give a new heart to the people. Okay, so the problem, of course, is that we've got our typical pattern. There's a covenant that's made, and then pretty quickly afterwards it's broken. And so over time, these people aren't dumb. They realize what's going on. They realize that what's happening is that there's some kind of internal obstacle. Okay, so they've got this external accountability, but it's almost like they're addicted to their sins. Okay, they just can't. And so Jeremiah expresses this by saying, well, what the problem is that Israel has its sins written on the tablets of their hearts with a pen of iron and a tip of diamond. Okay. So the problem there is that those are indelible. Okay? So what you need really is a new heart. Okay? And so Jeremiah says that there will be a new law, which will not be like the old law, okay? Which means not like any of the articulations of the covenant, which are progressive and successive. Okay? This new law will actually give the people a new heart, by which the law will be, or on which the law will be written. And so it's almost like like covenant fidelity will flow out of the law, out of their hearts. And so the source of covenant fidelity will come within themselves rather than being imposed from outside by an external law. Okay? Excuse me. So that leads us to the brink of the new covenant. Okay, that is where Matthew leads off. So Matthew is the first book in the New Testament, canonically speaking. It comes first in the table of contents. It's the longest gospel, and it's no accident that Matthew begins with a genealogy. Okay? So if you recall the book of Genesis, in the book of Genesis, the first word, Genesis, could also mean genealogy. And so, again, it's no accident. Matthew, who's writing this gospel, is deliberately calling your minds to the opening of the Old Testament, where there is a Genesis or a genealogy as well. So what we have is Matthew making a case that with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, what you see is a kind of new creation that is accomplished in Jesus Christ. A restoration of the new heavens and the new earth will be accomplished in Jesus Christ himself, in his humanity, in his human nature, in his body. And so you can see that the basic message of the Gospel of Matthew is fulfillment. That Jesus Christ is the new Moses. He's the fulfillment of the prophecies of a new Davidic king, and he is in his own person a new Israel, who brings a new law and is a fulfillment of the law and prophets. So if you take a look throughout the Gospel, Matthew actually quotes the Old Testament 41 times, and 37 of those times when he quotes the Old Testament, those quotations are introduced by the saying, quote, that it might be fulfilled. So fulfillment then is, you might say, the overarching theme of the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, now, we have some reason to think that the Gospel of Matthew is directed toward a Jewish audience, or it's a more sort of Jewish-leaning audience, an audience that would be familiar with the Old Testament, and so Matthew makes use of the Old Testament a good deal. And that's actually one of the reasons why I've chosen Matthew as one of the two Gospels that we'll read together, because after having gone through the Old Testament, it's nice having a Gospel that directly addresses what we've been studying together. Okay. Now, that does bring up another issue, the fact that there are 4 Gospels, okay, not just one, but 4, okay, and there